Okay. Great. So we're now broadcasting and people will be hopping in the next couple of next 30 seconds or so. Great. So I already see we have a couple of people already in on the webinar. Welcome, everyone. Looking forward to our session today on the view from Beijing, Xi'an, and Dongguan, how China's evolving international schools and recovering economy may shape international recruitment and admissions in 2020. Despite not being a very brief topic, I do think it's, or a succinct one, I think it's a really important one as we turn into 2020 and as we're beginning to see new admission and application data and numbers from universities around the world. We think that it's a really useful time to kind of take stock of these broader questions of what's going on in China, especially since so many overseas admissions officers have been unable to visit the country for many months now. So really happy to bring together a couple of I think if you've traveled much in China, you might know some of our panelists already. So really happy to bring together three pretty influential voices in the Chinese college counseling community. Francis, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe tell us what your Spring Festival plans are?
Sure, thanks, David. So my name is Francis Miller. I'm a director of college counseling at Xi'an TA High School in Shanxi province in China. That's the Shanxi with 2 A's. And the home of the Terracotta Warriors and much more. Anyway, I guess Spring Festival plans, we've effectively been prohibited from traveling to other provinces. So no real plans yet, but whatever it's gonna be, it's gonna be in Shanxi.
Awesome. So, yeah. And Shiny?
Yeah, hi Shiny. Hi everyone. Good morning or good evening. So Shiny Wang from Tsinghua University High School. I'm director of college counseling here and also assistant to the principal. So like for the Spring Festival, probably you noticed that like Beijing already isolated and surrounded by Hebei provinces. So Hebei suffering the COVID-19. So like they are coming back. So which means like we cannot go outside. Probably we'll stay in Beijing and we'll spend all the time here in Beijing. I mean, that is also similar to Xi'an. That's like highly recommended we should stay in Beijing. So.
And Ming?
Hi everyone. My name is Ming. I'm the director of college counseling at Xi'an School. Recently moved to Dongguan, so this is a new position. So the school is in Dongguan, and like Francis and Shiny, we've been discouraged from traveling because there's been 2 cases in Dongguan, which has been just a pretty big scare because Dongguan has been relatively case-free for the past 6 months. So anyways, with for Chinese New Year, I think I'll be spending a lot more time with my baby girl. And I forgot to mention, I think on the slide, maybe there's been, I typed it in, maybe I missed it. There should not be an N between my email. So if you're emailing me, it will be Ming Rong Wang without the N in the middle.
Okay, yeah, we'll make sure to update that before we send off the PDF version to everyone. And hi everyone, my name is David Weeks. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Sunrise International. We help run recruitment tours around China. So we bring colleges and universities from overseas and organize group travel to different Chinese high schools and universities. And we also help universities to create local Chinese social media accounts and websites, other ways to directly meet with students outside of the scope of inter-university partnerships and kind of recruiting beyond agency relationships. Yeah, it's my pleasure to help moderate this discussion. And I realized that, yeah, I mean, amid sort of advisories against travel, it's a tough time to be considering Chinese New Year plans. On the other hand, I guess for those of you who are in countries or cities where we've kind of been in lockdown on and off for a year, I guess we can all kind of take solace in the fact that we're alone or more isolated than we would otherwise be, but we're all together in it. Which I feel like is like a common refrain for folks who've been in international admissions this year. We're all in it together, even if it's been a challenging or difficult time. It's with that with that in mind that I kind of wanted to open or contextualize the discussion. So we've been seeing a lot of really mixed signals about the effects of COVID-19 and on international student mobility from China, and on the interest and appetite for study overseas from Chinese students. We're hearing some news stories that are apocalyptic, saying that no Chinese students are traveling to the US, or that visas are plummeting. On the other hand, we're hearing very positive stories and a lot of anticipation about a possible change in the political administration in the US. Of course, we recognize that we don't have just US universities here. So, there's also broader discussions and a lot of optimism about the vaccine. But on the other hand, we're hearing about some stories about how the handling of COVID-19 across the world. Not every country has been as fortunate as China in containing the virus, and this has possibly led to a little bit of concern from some Chinese families about the safety or feasibility of traveling overseas. So it's amid this kind of climate of nervous anticipation, cautious optimism, and the occasional sort of apocalyptic headline that we thought it would be useful to actually offer a perspective from some first and second tier cities in China, straight from counselors who are working with families as they kind of work through these same questions. So in terms of an agenda, first we'll talk about the Chinese economy. I feel like we oftentimes ask these questions about whether or not students are interested in going overseas or what countries they're choosing, evolving preferences, but oftentimes we miss the bigger socioeconomic picture. So obviously for many students, studying overseas is not a cheap process. It's a very high stakes decision, both personally and economically. So it's important to think about what's happening in the Chinese economy and how that's kind of percolating beyond the headlines and the sort of high level government announcements, how that's actually percolating down to individual families and into different cities across China. Second, there's been some quite mixed reporting about what's happening with international schools in China. So obviously, enrollment in and applications to international schools in China are pretty nice predictors of how excited people are to study overseas. Of course, some students do study overseas from public schools, or some people study in China for undergraduate and then go on to a graduate program overseas. But there is, I think, something in the tea leaves to read about what's happening with international schools and in the communities and schools that you guys work at. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the data and some of the anecdotal stories that we're hearing about what's going on. If time permits, we can also talk a little bit more about evolving choices of study destination. So is the US, is the UK and Canada's sort of meteoric rise over the last 2 years? Can we expect that to continue? Is the US set for a comeback in relative terms because of political developments? What are some things to consider there? We'll also have some suggestions for you. So even if you're a China veteran, or if you're new to recruiting in China, we'll have some more concrete suggestions for you. And then finally, we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. But if you have any comments, thoughts, or questions, we definitely encourage you to ask or use the chat, and we'll do our best to work your comments or questions into the discussion as well. So why do this now? Well, first, we think that it's an important time to reflect, where universities are getting a clearer picture of exactly how many students actually applied from China. And there were sort of competing predictions about whether or not there would be a lot of pent-up demand from last year, students who deferred because of COVID or concerns about taking classes online, and whether or not all those students would kind of come back in force. And in some institutions, we have read some stories about particular schools seeing almost doubling of the number of applications they've gotten. So it's a useful time, I think, to reflect on what's on the application cycle that's winding down. And I think that it's also useful because many universities, if they have the ability to send people to physical events in China in the spring, they're also considering and planning spring travel, or maybe mapping out some contingencies for if fall travel is feasible. What might that look like? For schools, Chinese schools are also reflecting a little bit because we're entering the frenzied last couple of weeks before final exams and before the winter holidays begin in China for the Lunar New Year. It's also a time of anticipation. everyone's excited about the vaccine. I'm currently dialing from Washington, D.C. People are a little excited, sometimes in unproductive and violent ways, about the Biden administration. It's, there's, I think, a time for anticipation. Maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to see each other face to face sometime soon. And I think that there's certainly cause for being excited there. There's also some new data that's been released. Economic data from the fourth quarter of 2020 is coming out. Sunrise is going to be publishing in the next 2 weeks a white paper that we do each year about international schools in China and some trends that we're seeing, and some possible predictions that some predictions that we're expecting for the following year. And finally, there's still barriers for us to be able to directly communicate. We all kind of live on Zoom, but there's a sort of fatigue to constantly chatting over Zoom, and we don't have those sort of casual conversations or those casual conversations about what we're seeing in our communities. It's a little bit harder to share from afar. So that's kind of the intro and the background. Why now? Why do this? So let's talk a little bit about some of the sort of higher level economic data before I turn the floor over to for discussion. So generally, China has experienced, roughly speaking, a V-shaped recovery, which means that the GDP has recovered. GDP growth has come close to pre-COVID levels. Now, that hasn't been completely evenly distributed across the country. There's definitely been, there is, I think, a lot of analysis that's saying that you're seeing that more in urban China, less in rural China. So a lot of the economic recovery hasn't come to the countryside and to tier 4 and below cities yet. Property markets tend to be are doing quite well, though. And that's an important thing to bear in mind, because studying overseas university tuition is quite, it's a high amount of money for a Chinese family, or for many of them. And many families do finance overseas study by selling property or other like highly valuable fungible assets. So the property market is something to watch, because oftentimes that can be a major funding source. So the property market is actually up compared to year on year from October 20 to October 2019. However, this V-shaped recovery has in large part been led by state-funded investment projects, bridges, roads, stuff like that, and through state-owned enterprises. So China telling the Bank of China to hire 10,000 fresh graduates beyond what they would have otherwise. We're not seeing as much, the official data suggests that unemployment has went way up during the pandemic, and it's gone down. But I think that those official statistics from the National Bureau of Statistics in China are a bit deceptive, because those figures do exclude migrant workers. There are hundreds of millions of those in China. It excludes, it counts as employed freelance workers. So if you wrote a blog post and got paid for it 1 month, you're employed, even if that's agnostic to your guaranteed income or whether or not that's even above the minimum wage. It also obscures a big dynamic of, or a big demographic question of youth unemployment. I think a really telling statistic is that the number of drivers for Meituan, which is a Chinese delivery company, kind of like Uber Eats, the percentage of Meituan drivers who hold a BA has gone up from 16% to 25% in the last year. Now, driving for Meituan is not fun. You have to ride on an electric bike. You're kind of in the delivery times are incredibly fast. So oftentimes drivers have to sacrifice safety and run red lights to meet their delivery times. In other words, it's not a very fun or safe job, and it's not particularly lucrative. So this tells us, this is, I think, an interesting anecdotal story of the fact that youth unemployment may be a good deal higher than these national level statistics suggest, and it may be a good deal harder for recent graduates and your returnees who are your graduating seniors who are coming back to China to find a job that's of the same caliber as they might have in 2019. And of course, there are some sectors of the economy where we're not quite back to normal. Even if China's done better than a lot of other countries with handling the pandemic, it's a really rough year still to be a concert organizer, to own a hotel, to be involved in hospitality. And you may have a citywide shutdown that, if you own a restaurant, may make your job and your livelihood a lot harder. So these are some of the broad sort of background statistics that I think might inform the discussion. But we can all read this online. We'd love to hear from you guys. What are the official how do these official statistics square with your experience in the cities that you live in? Are you seeing storefronts open and kind of like they were in 2019? Do you see that in students? Are they coming to school with new clothes, new electronics or phones? Are you seeing on social media people like posting nice domestic travel vacation photos, at least before the lockdowns in your cities? Yeah, does this square with your reality, or how are you guys seeing that in your community? Francis, I think you mentioned
I'll take a stab at this.
Okay, sounds good.
So my school is a very expensive school. It's one of the most expensive school in the greater Bay Area, like near the Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Dongguan areas. So I'll say for my students, most of the family has not been impacted to that extent. As in what I've concluded was that families that are in the higher social economic ladder tend to be okay. They tend to have more money, more sort of golden nest that they've stored away to sort of help them through the rough times. But our school is located in Dongguan, which is a sort of like a third tier city almost. Most of a lot of the economy is based on factories. What I've seen is there's not a lot of workers left in Dongguan, partially because some of them are going back home, some of them are being left home. They haven't come back since the 2020 of January. So what I've seen on the storefronts are definitely that the ones that are international brand, the ones that are nationally branded, they're still opening up, right? You can still see them popping up. Like the milk tea shops that are recognized are still up there. But it's these little, hole in the walls, those restaurants, those mom and pop shops that are not reopening up, that they're leaving to go back to their laojia, or they've gone broke, or they've been impacted heavily by COVID. So that's what I've been seeing. And we do have students who are slightly impacted. We had one student who moved away who had to transfer out of our school because of tuition. But that's very, very rare. At least at Xi'an, we haven't seen that much of it.
And Francis, you'd mentioned that you'd put together some thoughts about, what things are looking like in Xi'an, sort of in terms of general perceptions, and maybe in terms of how this is affecting how students and families are considering studying overseas. Mind sharing?
Sure. So I guess in Xi'an, the international school community or international program community is perhaps a little bit smaller than a lot of the coastal cities. So we only have really a handful of international programs here, but I think there's only one program in Xi'an that experienced stable or increased enrollment over the past year, whereas I think all the other international programs in Xi'an experienced a decline in enrollment for their senior one, or as a US 10 equivalent grades. I think just like on the ground here, there's a big mall that closed in the middle of Xi'an. That might have been related to, there's a lot of rumors why that happened, but I think certainly the economy a contributing factor. There's a lot of closed storefronts, mostly small stores, like family-owned stores. I think something else that recently came up was like a lot of the workers who are kind of they flow between construction sites. A lot of those migrant workers are finding it very, very difficult to get jobs right now. And in Xi'an recently, we had like 3 subway lines open before the end of last year. And they all opened early, which, in the United States, like I'm from Philadelphia, I can't imagine that happening in the US ever. A big public works project opening early. But I think that shows, the government is trying its best to create investment and stimulate the economy in whatever way possible. So, yeah.
And are you finding that are parents or students asking more about scholarships than before? Is your sense that any of the students that you're working with, and Shiny, please feel free to chime in as well, are you hearing more questions about schools that compete more on value but maybe less expensive, and perhaps a family may not have considered as much? Are people being a little bit more sensitive to financial considerations, or sort of value as compared to sort of the very, the highest ranked or the best school that they could possibly get into for undergraduate study?
I guess
We have a
so.
scholarship program at our school, but we haven't seen more people inquiring about it. I think the value of the scholarship in the eyes of my parents, at least, of our is that the more we give them, it means that their students are more valued at our school, not because they can't afford the tuition. I think there's that sense of pride behind them seeking the scholarship. Is the fact that they are able, their child is able to receive that much scholarship from a prestigious school. If scholarship or if tuition has been such a big problem, I think Harrow just announced Harrow is opening a branch in Shenzhen, and I think according to the news media, it has the most expensive tuition in the Greater Bay Area, and it hasn't been open yet.
Interesting. So, and Francis, you were saying, yeah, any sense of whether or not the state of the economy is impacting how people are considering questions about value or sensitivity to the availability of financial aid or tuition increases?
I think there are definitely more questions about that. I know that a lot of my students, they've been, how do you say, this isn't the first year I think I've ever had students proactively find me with information about scholarship like opportunities to the schools they've applied to. Usually it's just a non-issue. It's like something we, at our school, we just don't even really talk about that much with our students. Most of them are kind of, we try to set the expectation early that they're probably going to end up paying full or near full tuition. But I think this is like, there have been a lot of students who have come to discuss financial aid or seeking merit scholarships or other kind of financial support from universities.
And
Well,
Shiny, do you have any sense of how the macro economy is affecting your students in Beijing?
yeah, it's like I think as for the first question, I think it's a very interesting to notice that when you just like living in some big cities like Beijing, probably some audience have been to Beijing before. So like, even during the pandemic, like probably the April, maybe the March or April or May last year, when you just like, had some tour in Sanlitun, as like probably that is a very high profile places that you can find that it's a very normal, it's like just like common things. Lots of people still there, drinking coffee, have some bar, like, they have very fancy restaurant packed with people. But when you move to like the big mall, like in the West, like, near Beijing Capital Academy or like RDFZ or Tsinghua High, or maybe some other areas like Wangfujing area, you will notice that maybe not like that crowded like before, which means like the people who can afford and just like they can also afford the big tuition, because this group of people, they just like means that they got no seriously impact from COVID-19 economically. I travel around like during the summer in other cities to deliver some lectures. I found similar, like Shanghai, like like Chengdu, like Guangzhou, like the World Trade Center area or the financial area. You can see that lots of people still there. They have fun. But on the other hand, when you visit like a Dongguan, like some other second tier or the third tier, you can find that maybe people, they don't go out to have big fun and like the gathering or some like banquet, but also they probably prefer to have delivery or they home cooking stuff, like they become the chef themselves. So it means that it's like the people who can afford high tuition in we can say private schools in the big city, like the metropolitan city, like Beijing, Shanghai, they still can afford it. Just like Ming said, they don't care about scholarship. They care about it because they believe they are well recognized. It's kind of honor, doesn't mean that they cannot afford it. So similar to apply for the higher education overseas. I mean, it's like the same. Very few students come to me to say, hey, well, I will apply for the school because they can offer me the scholarship. They also still consider the school, whether they have good quality or whether they are fit for the students, the family to pursue their higher education overseas.
And Ming, you had mentioned that sort of, an interesting perspective of scholarships more being a sort of proxy for how much the school wants the student and sort of like an honor, a bit of bragging rights maybe. Not so much as, really impacting the dollars and cents of a particular family, because many of your families aren't in the middle class, they're wealthier. Do you also, Carrie asks, are you also seeing that same logic being applied when students are considering studying overseas? So for like undergrad.
I think for overseas, because the tuition is so expensive, they do like to see a return on their investment. I think one that has to do with the fact that most of the Chinese students will have to come back to China for employment, right? I think high percentages, very few percentages actually staying in the States, especially with the current visa situation. So they need to know that when they come back, their school or the university they attended will be recognized. So if it's not, it doesn't matter how much they pay as long as they come back and find a job. Second, for our students, going to the US has been a huge, they've been sort of switching away from the US at this point, just because of the recent political environment in the last 4 years. And then with COVID and the control of COVID, parents are being really, really concerned and increasingly more concerned regarding sending his kids abroad, which is why more sort of British curriculums are opening up in our area.
Got it. And so you mean that this sort of like trend of, it probably peaked in 2016, of sending students overseas for high school, that's sort of begun to decrease and it's sort of accelerated by COVID, staying, studying in a local international school as opposed to, going to a boarding school seems like a safer bet. Does that sound about right?
Yes, we have a number of students who we took in from, because they came back from their boarding program abroad. There's no place they can go, and their parents wasn't about to send them back. So in the end, I think half of I'll say there's a good, there's only about 36 students in our grade 10 class. And I'll say 10, maybe 20 of them were new. And from that, about 5 or 6 of them were from boarding program from the States or the UK.
Got it. So one other question to kind of round out this discussion about the economy. It seems like we've been touching a little bit on some of the international school topics we'll get to in a minute. But so and we just mentioned this sort of question about reframing value, the big value being what is your employability when you get back from China. So finding a good job is, in China is getting harder for returnees because of the rising youth unemployment rate, and just generally firms are hiring less than they were in 2019. So we know that good job placements are always sort of important for universities' pitch to students. But should international admissions should international admissions view advocating for the interests of their students in career offices as part of their core mission statement? In other words, are there examples of things that some universities have done really well to connect some of the students you've worked with in the past with employment opportunities when they get back to China? Are there any like interesting case studies or interesting tactics that you've seen where university admissions officers have kind of made good on the sort of pitch of, well, our university has great career placement options. Look what we've done in China. Any examples, best practices or case studies that you guys have seen for, speaking in realer terms to this question of finding a job when they get back?
Sure. Well, I guess, overall, like this past fall, being able to hear a lot of online webinars from universities, I think a lot of universities are more sensitive to this, are more kind of aware of their need to provide extra value to international students. I think there are a couple of schools that notably have kind of beefed up their career counseling for international students and have done more outreach to Chinese companies or kind of just in the Asia Pacific region in general. And that's really, really great. I think one of the really incredible examples that I saw was I'll highlight Sun Tia from Illinois Wesleyan University. He had basically in a presentation that he gave, he had 5 recent Chinese graduates and had tracked their progress from his university, which graduate schools they had gone to or which jobs they went to. And that was very powerful to be able to see that kind of tracking that kind of data and to show the outcomes for their students. So, it's nice to hear that, universities graduates go on to Apple, Google, Microsoft, or whatever amazing companies, but to be able to provide like some very solid results and examples of international students and their successes after graduation from college, especially if they're from a region that you're talking to, is incredibly powerful for a student audience.
Any other pitches or tactics that you guys have seen that spoke to this question about getting a job when you come back home that you thought were particularly useful or particularly effective?
Yeah, I think it's like in the past 2 years, like because of H-1B is not kind of easy, and also we know that's like OPTs right now. It's like in the past, 6 months they are just up and down. Lots of people and the parents and the students are really concerned about it, even for the postgrad. So for the Chinese market, I think lots of admission officers, and they do the presentation, they will cover this part of the grad, after they graduate from the college, where the Chinese students going. And also I think probably by accident, that's like the COVID-19, people cannot go to the States to study in the campus. Some schools, they have very nice friendship, or some China's university, like the partner to host those group people here in China. It's like some, university, like jokingly, but it's the fact that the Cornell, they have the campus and they have students studying in Tsinghua, Peking University, and so on. So which means the students, they probably in their junior, or maybe sophomore, they can have more time to be here in China. If possible, they can go to internship even. So they can work like practical training or practical fields in some Chinese domestic, the enterprise or the company, to have this kind of background working here in China, as well as studying in China for American higher education. I think it's a very interesting thing happening. So that is the cons and the pros of the COVID-19. It's like they got the impact, but also have some positive thing that you can see, like the opportunity and the chance for the students to adapt to the new situation, and they probably can benefit from this thing.
And I think that idea of inculcating an in-country network that's sort of specific to China, I think that's one thing that that COVID-19 may have fostered a little bit faster for some universities, but I think hopefully that's something that stays. So I graduated from Swarthmore College, which is a pretty small liberal arts school, but oftentimes, our alumni groups, we join forces with the TRICO consortium. So, we end up with larger alumni events because we team up with other schools. That's been pretty helpful. That was pretty helpful for me personally when I went to China. I can say that, and Dave Weivel points out, I think quite rightly, that some universities have done a good job with setting up alumni networks in China, and in particular, promoting their university to prospective companies or to industries. So NYU and OSU, he calls out as good examples. Yeah, I would say one final thought is that the handshake platform, which is very popular among career offices, is really not very easy for a Chinese company who's not super familiar with simplicity or handshake. It's not a very user-friendly interface for a non-native English speaker or an HR director who focuses mostly on hiring in China. I've even heard from some career offices, sorry, we don't accept international postings, or sorry, we don't accept postings that look or feel or sound in any way like an English teaching job, even though obviously that might be something that your graduates or alumni may be very competitive in, and may actually earn a pretty nice entry level salary. after they graduate. So I think it's also useful to kind of maybe consider from an employer's perspective, what is the user interface and user experience of trying to share a job with your university? Bear in mind that Chinese HR directors may not necessarily know what NACE is or how Handshake works. Maybe having an explainer of how that works would be something really helpful and something that might blunt the economic impact that the COVID-19 is having on families in the long run. Any last thoughts on the economic piece before we move on to the international school half of the discussion? Okay, well, let's get to it then. So Chinese K-12 international schools, they've been growing in number really rapidly, especially in the last decade. So we went from having around 275 international schools in 2010 to having more than, to having about 1,000 with official licensing and about 1,500 that were operating without full licensing or where their license was pending. So it's up 5% this year, but if you look across the decade, it's up many times. We have seen, as Ming alluded to earlier, a growth in the number of British affiliated or UK branded boarding schools or international schools in China. So Harrow, Dulwich, these other names you may have heard of. So there's 37 campuses now run by that are sort of branch campuses of UK boarding schools. Of the different kinds of international schools in China, the ones that are private international schools, as opposed to ones that focus on expatriates or those that are affiliated to a public school, the ones that are standalone private schools have grown the fastest. But as I think everyone has had alluded to earlier, enrollments seem to be dropping at some international schools. So that's a little bit of an ambiguous thing to say, right? So how is it that we have, we're increasing the number of international schools 5% every year and more than doubling over a decade, and yet enrollment's declining? What's happening here? Are these international schools crazy? Have they just been forecasting incorrectly? Is this just a short-term COVID thing? I think there's lots of ways to think about that. Maybe it's a long-term decline. Maybe it's just more competition, more schools, and the market for international education just isn't growing that fast. Families might be cutting costs year to year, or maybe playing a wait and see approach because it's harder to transfer from an international curriculum back to the Gaokao local one than to go from Gaokao local to international. And if it's the latter, then maybe that suggests that recruitment way into the future where there's more kids in public schools, it might start to look a little bit more like the olden days where most Chinese students were in public schools and then working with agents or private sector counselors, because public schools in China, unless you're an international department, generally don't have an in-school counselor, or that's much rarer. In terms of the geography of all this, I think it's interesting. China, of course, is not just Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen. There's 130 cities with more than 1 million people. 59% of the population is now urban. You think of Chicago as a huge city, but Changzhou, Taizhou, Zibo, if you've never heard these cities, that's okay, but each of them is bigger than Chicago. Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities are growing the fastest in number in international schools. So you can see here an index of the provincial distribution of international schools. And you can see here that Jiangsu province actually has more international schools than Beijing. And the leader of the pack is kind of a bit deceptive in that Guangdong includes first, second, third, and fourth tier cities. But you can see clearly here that a province with only Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities has more international schools than Beijing. And as a national percentage of the pie, provinces with only Tier 2 plus cities are home to the majority of international schools in China now. But if you look at, say, membership in international ACAC, you might walk away with the conclusion that most of the international education going on in China is Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. But the data actually suggests a growing decentralization of internet and growing sort of democratization of access to international schools. In terms of how students are behaving, we're also noticing some regional differences. This is based on a survey done in mid-year, but you can see that students in Tier 2 cities were actually much more likely to delay their plan to study abroad or study overseas. They're more likely to defer, whereas students in first tier cities were not likely to cancel, but they were a little bit more likely to, there was a pretty even distribution between canceling overseas, changing destinations, and deferring. And then the students in tier 3 and 4 cities who perhaps are a little bit more value conscious were more likely to change their study destination. So there's some interesting ways to think about like China, not just as one market, but of many markets, and in thinking about those in terms of the tiering of cities. Meanwhile, we have seen schools reopen in many places. So schools have long since been reopened and have been doing offline classes, although there have been periodic citywide lockdowns. The past couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of those, particularly in anticipation of Chinese New Year and everyone traveling all over the place. It does seem to depend a lot on the school and the place, but there are still some restrictions on outside visitors. But there was a pretty big event, you might have heard of it, called East Meets West, organized by one of our panelists here. East Meets West was hosted at Ming's school. Shiny was one of the organizers, and it had lots of people that came together, and there was even a college fair. There's also recruitment tours that are now coming back. Sunrise is having offline recruitment tours for in-country representatives or people who have folks in country. And some schools in Shanghai are also announcing free fairs like those string of fairs in in March that are coming back in hybrid form. So if you can make it in person, great. If you can't, there's a virtual option. And maybe, just maybe, sometime in the future, if you're stuck overseas, can't get back into China, maybe there's a possibility that there will be a sort of vaccine passporting system where if you're confirmed that you've been vaccinated, perhaps you will be able to travel and enter China. So I've been doing a lot of talking and I want to open the floor back up. So how do we interpret this ambiguous data about more international schools opening up and yet high school enrollments decreasing? Are families just waiting and seeing? Does this suggest that the golden age of international schools is coming to an end in China? What's the best way to interpret this?
David, do you know if the international schools that are opening, are they K-12 or just like high school?
That includes K-12. So those figures would capture, say, K-7 or K-8. And I mean, but of course, that's also worth mentioning that a lot of schools begin with just pre-K and elementary and primary, and then middle school, and then eventually build a high school once their kids kind of grow into it. But the data that I presented was K-12, or excuse me, was inclusive of any international school that's full-time, full day. So that's not specific to high school.
Yeah. What I think is, I think, at least for my parents, of what I've observed here, a lot of my parents are definitely waiting and seeing. So if the parent has a younger child, they're okay with enrolling them in an international program because there's plenty of time to decide what to do, right? You still have like a lot of years to go before you actually apply to any university. It's the students in high school, in the upper school, that the parents they have to make a decision now. And a lot of them are very hesitant on doing so. So they've taken a step back instead. So they're remaining in their older programs, whether it's in the Gaokao curriculum or some other curriculum. So what I'm seeing is that families are not really saving money, I think, because our target student population aren't students who can't afford the tuition. So most of the time, like I said before, they haven't been impacted so much by COVID-19. Usually for them, it's whether it's safe to go out, whether or not the destination country are still going to be friendly to Chinese international students. I think that's one of the biggest concerns at the beginning of the breakout.
Well, I think it's not about the international school. It is about the expectations from different parts involved in this field. I mean, it's like the schools, the new schools coming up because of the investors that what they want. For example, like in Beijing, it's like, you can see Haidian district, the people, we have new campuses in Tsinghua University High. The reason is like the government, the education administration, they probably want to attract more talented and also the good overseas of staff, employers to come. So that is why we have very nice K-12, schools are high, it's like advanced education here in order to attract more people living in this district. On the other hand, some like Bay areas, because like they already have a lot of talented guys, and also did that kind of a genius and also intellectuals. They need this kind of a higher higher end education for their kids, for their children. So there will be more international schools there. They just building the new international school. So this is two different track, but also we can share. They got expectation from the parents, from the education administration, and also from the students. On the other hand, the new schools from K-12, like Ming said, the younger kids, the better they can predict if there's some situation like a scenario overseas, like global situation happening, change, they will change back to the Gaokao track, the national curriculum thing. It's easier for the young kid, but for the higher, like the high level, like the high school, it's hard. They cannot adapt to it. Even for the middle school, I met a lot of parents coming to me to say, my kid wants to study in the international program. And because of the situation currently, they move back to the national curriculum. But 1 year later, their kids found it's not the thing I want. It's not the education I'm used to. They want to come back to the international program, either like international school or we call it the high school international division, like the 国际班. So they want to come back. So we can see it's hard to predict, but for some second tier, frankly and practically, the second tier and the third tier cities, even they have new schools, they have the big name, the franchise of the international one. I do not have very optimistic view about it, because like the pool who can afford a higher education, this kind of education, and the pool who have this kind of sense of international education, I really don't know in favor of it. I don't think they can survive in the coming years, because like they're already studying there, they already some schools there, and they are struggling. If you have a new one, doesn't mean that people will believe that your school is good. They will move from some cities to their like migrants, like the birds. No way. They can't. So for example, like a Hainan province, they said we have a very good policy, but they don't have a population. They don't have the people who really want this kind of education. I really don't know. It's economically, it's not a good thing. And also for the education, I think that is also bad. Okay, that's my personal point.
So we've got a supply side glut, in other words. Like there's more schools now than there is demand, or that there seemed to be some adjustment there. And,
well, the buildings are also delayed. Like these were work in progress from before COVID-19. They weren't put into session after, right? These were planned way before. And in the Greater Bay Area, there's been a shortage of schools to begin with. Like in terms of demand, there has been so much demand, but so less supply. Public school, like private schools, has always been sort of occupying half the market in this area. So the international school rising up, I think it was inevitable, but we just don't know if enrollment will actually be like the schools will actually remain open after 2 years.
And I guess to speak more directly to our audience, which is mostly universities here, I guess so. The statistics do suggest there's more schools opening up, but the number of takers for Zhongkao, right, which governs admission to Chinese high schools, has increased, and it does seem like anecdotally we're seeing some stories about, with some exceptions, that people are kind of turning back towards the public track. At least the folks on the margin, the people who weren't quite sure, on the fence, or maybe who are more middle class, for whom the financial commitment is a little bit scarier. Does anyone have a sense of whether or not this is just people waiting and seeing, or is your sense that the people who, those extra people who are taking Zhongkao or pivoting to the public track this year, is your sense that that's sort of a permanent commitment or suggestive of a longer term trend? In other words, do you see this sort of just as hedging your bets and waiting and seeing, or suggestive of a longer term trend?
I mean, I can take a little bit of that question. So in my high school, we're a very traditional Chinese high school. We have 3 class years, and then we also, so most of our students for both of our domestic division, which is Gaokao track for Chinese universities, and also our international curriculum center, which is AP and A-level, geared towards preparing students to go abroad outside of China. Both of those divisions recruit students primarily from affiliated middle schools that are also in our our school's education group. And then those middle schools recruit students from affiliated elementary schools. And I think overall, I think it's too early to tell. I think that there's certainly we've gotten a lot of interest from parents and students in joining us next year. But I think really until this summer, when a lot of parents and students start to commit to their, this new class of 10th graders, it's going to be too hard to tell before then.
And let's talk about, as college counselors, obviously college fairs and rep visits are a huge part of what you guys do. So how about college fairs this coming spring or possibly next fall? So we just had Eats Meets West in last fall. Can we expect some more brick and mortar college fairs in China? Are we going to continue to have the slew of Zoominars or something in between? Are your schools planning on hosting events face to face? And is it worth it for schools to try to attend if so?
Well, I think the virtually the info session is not that kind of helpful for the students and the parents. 2 things. The first one is very hard for the counselors to organize. Even we post it, we encourage students to attend it, but for the difference of time zone, a different time. So like the parents probably and the students, they will stay at home, and we recommend they log in. Doesn't mean that they really did. So that is turn out is not that kind of optimistic and promising for the mission officers to notice that even they have very nice well prepared info session, but very few, maybe fewer than a dozen people just appearing. So for us, like I think the personal interaction in the campus, like the college fair, is very helpful. Like East Meets West, Ming already noticed that it's packed out of our expectation. More than 300 families come to this lecture hall. But for the current situation, the COVID here in China, I think in winter, no way. In spring, we will wait and see, just like the parents. So we really don't know. Especially for the people who just flying around. Basically, I think maybe for some, we should say the local college fair probably is possible, which means like a Great Bay Area, like Beijing or Shanghai, or maybe Chengdu, just in the city. Like some people will come there, and also the admission officer the representative here in China, they can send their people, their staff to come to the school to have a very, very small size. The college fair probably will be okay based on the principals, his or her opinion and authority, whether he or she likes to have it or not. In Beijing, so some foreigners come to our school, even in the past semester, not possible. Even you are Chinese. You live in China for in the past whole year. No way, you cannot get into my campus. If I want you to come in, I should send a lot of go through a lot of procedure proposal for the leaders to approve. So it's so complicated. So I meet the guy outside of the campus in a coffee shop. So that's the only thing I can do. Yeah, really nice talk, but you cannot meet the students. So yeah, that is the thing I have to share. Luckily that we probably have organized some other things, like probably some representative alumni. You can have some local event outside of campus, ask the counselors to recommend the students to go to that college fair. That is probably okay. But if we host it in the campus, that is Xi'an school. Their principal can do it, but doesn't mean that everyone can do it. So that's my point.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Shiny talked about, I think for public schools, it's especially difficult because they have mandates from the Education Bureau. If there's any incident that happened of, any whisper of it on campus, it really brings back a huge backlash. But for private schools like ours, we can plan things that we think are be beneficial. So we can weigh the pros and cons and say, let's go ahead and do it. But what my concern is that we don't have, there's not enough representative available to actually make a college fair. We would love to do a college fair, but are the reps even traveling? That's one thing, right? Are even if you're based in Beijing, kind of can't travel right now either. So is the traveling not just internationally, but domestically is one problem. Two, if you are asking your alumni or non-Asian partners to kind of help, how helpful are they really? Can you train them properly? Because we do have some universities who've given sort of authority to their alumni or the non-Asian party, be like, can you go and represent us at the fair? But that person may not know anything about the programmings, what the admissions process, and that to us and then to the parents and students who are attending the fair, it just seems like you just brought someone else who's just going to give out a pamphlet. And in that case, then why don't you just ship me a box of pamphlet and I can give them out, right? Save you the money too. So I think that there are two ways to think about it. We would love to have a fair. And if we do have a fair, we'll definitely send out invitations and we'd love to have you represented. But we want it to be a very, very well-represented presentation. We want to make sure that our kids can really truthfully learn about your school and that they learn and they will like your school. So if you give a bad experience, that really stays with them for a long time. And then kids are very impressionable, so they will not take a second look.
I think that's really true. I think that's really well taken. I mean, so calling back to what Shiny was saying, I think that obviously it's really hard to replace the in-person touch. And for that reason, college fairs, when they can happen, or college recruitment events that are live are, I mean, they're indispensable if you can do them. For those without in-country representatives, making sure that they are well trained, that they're professional, that they're that they stay on script if you have one, and that they can answer student questions effectively for when those come up. I think that's super important. So I wouldn't say that tag teaming just anyone who's who happens to be an alumni and sending them into a school or giving them some brochures is a panacea. I think that having one or two really well-trained people who you've worked with, who've maybe done this in the past, even pre-COVID, that might be something that can open the door for your university to visit schools in person. From Sunrise's perspective, the fairs that we always organize are generally the ones with about 20 schools and between 100 and 150 students. It's generally on campus. We don't aim for those massive 1,000-person fairs. And what we're seeing, it seems like what we expect, at least from what we're hearing from here and from other counselors, is that the in-person events in China that will happen are going to be a little bit more contained. They're going to be those smaller and medium-sized fairs or info sessions, as opposed to the massive citywide hotel ballroom ones. But of course, it's also important as you plan travel and budget and all that to remember that we live in unprecedented times, that things can change because of city lockdowns in China, just as they can in other countries. So, it's important to know, if you're working with someone in the private sector, what their cancellation policies are. And if you're working with someone, if you're doing this kind of in-house, then, making sure that you book changeable or refundable flights or making sure that the refund policies of the hotels and airlines that you're working with. All that stuff really matters. And of course, if you can't make it because this sounds too hard, or you prefer to just do online, then I think that it's important to remember that there are virtual alternatives to traveling to fairs, but that it's important to make sure that you're accommodating students on time zone and on platform, because not every student may have downloaded Zoom or have that loaded on their mobile phone. So be aware of your audience too. International school students might have, probably have Zoom, no problem. But if you mostly target Gaokao track students or students in tier 3 and 4 cities, then maybe doing broadcasts through a WeChat applet may be more effective. So
David,
we're seeing
I want to add one thing, because you talked about being friendly with different platforms. Zoom don't really work in China anymore because, one, of internet connection issues. Two, because new students, like new users, cannot be registered unless they have a US phone number, I think. So if you're targeting also like rising ninth graders, parents or students who are thinking about maybe further down the road going abroad, you have to use another broadcasting or meeting tool, because that's not going to work anymore. Most people in China use Tencent, but obviously that's not going to be helpful for the mission officers who don't use, who can't read or use Chinese or even have a Chinese phone. So I don't have a perfect solution to this, so just bring it out there.
No, I mean, if you have someone who can read Chinese and help you with the UX, that might be a workaround. For Sunrise's webcasts, which we've been doing since the pandemic, we use Weikaijiang, which is like a WeChat applet. It's not as clean or perfect from a presenter perspective as Zoom, but it's always accessible, and I mean, anyone in China has WeChat, right? So it's pretty easy.
One thing is probably for the education, I think the online thing, even the education, like a blended education, is the best application about the online or the remote teaching. So for us, probably you can make some change about the blended info session. You'll probably have some alumni, okay. But just like Ming said, alumni does not know anything about the process application thing, and also selection process and so on. So probably you can deliver online with some students or the alumni here can really represent and to show the culture of the campus and so on. So this is a kind of a blended info session. It will be more productive than the common thing. I think the students will benefit from it.
So we're seeing some really good questions, and I'd love to do some Q&A. As a closing thought, what are some things that we hope you guys will do this coming term? I'd ask each one of you guys to send in some sort of we hope you'll do this one thing. So yeah, what would we encourage, or what's our biggest recommendation of the universities who are here today? Ming, I think I have yours first.
Yeah, I have a couple of updates from my end, just because I have students who are younger. Our oldest cohort is G10. So as they're preparing for all the college application documents and different components, we're still looking at standardized testing policies, and whether or not what's going on this year will sort of continue to happen next year in terms of being flexible with standardized testing, or is test optional going to be permanent? Because then if that's the case, then that really impact the way we advise our students, because they still have time to prepare or either not prepare for these things. Also to reach out to individual schools, international school, private school, Chinese schools, whatever, for an online school visit. I know because most of you still can make it. I don't see it happening in the springtime ever. So I think online school presentations are going to be sort of the norm for the semester. But I would like to be a little bit more targeted. So maybe just, the admission officer with Xi'an school, or a couple of admission officers with different school representing different types of schools with Xi'an school, instead of a whole. It might be a little bit more time consuming and troublesome on the university part, but I think that leaves a really good impression on the students. And if you can also offer Chinese sessions for our parents, that will also be great. and send some swag because we can't see you, but we still love to have information. So if you have pamphlets, we're still in the process of decorating our college counseling office. So you have like pennants that you like to send me. My email will be there, so you can reach out to me. I'll send you my information. That will be it. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention there are a couple of questions about different platforms in the group chat. I think there's Voov, it's VOOV is like the Tencent meeting app that's for it's the English language one. I think that works decently well. Classin is another one that I know has been used. I think it's accessible within China without any kind of special software requirements. I think also Udemy has an online platform that they've used to host online fairs that is very accessible to Chinese students.
And Francis, what were your sort of like calls to action for, do you want to kind of explain what you're thinking about with sort of what we'd suggest of or ask of universities here?
Sorry, yes. I think basically, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide. The basically, I think a lot of Chinese students right now, because of the visa situation, especially for the U.S. And for the travel situation in general, are just very kind of down about when if and when they're able to actually go in person. And so I think one thing that universities I think could certainly do more of is, especially for enrolled students who have committed to your university, is to do what you can to do outreach to those students. Maybe send them something physical, like it could be like as small as a pen or like a mug or a water bottle or something. If you want to go big, you could send them a sweatshirt or whatever. But like sending some swag they can use to rep their university, to be excited to share a public way about their choice to go abroad. That can be like a big morale booster. It can also, thinking about how important yield is for schools, especially this year, that could be a way to try to boost your yield.
And Shiny, I don't think I had gathered one from you, but if you had to pick one thing that you would ask of universities as they consider how they're recruiting this coming spring, or doing admissions, what would your request or ask of the audience be?
I'm sorry, I was too busy in the past 2 days. Yeah, I think probably just get close connection with the college counselors here in China, no matter international school, public school, international division, and so on. Because we find some counselors, they cannot reach the targets of the school and also the universities in the States. Because recently, some people will ask me about a mission officer from some schools. They find they cannot find any person. And also international ACACs, directory is not that kind of update. So we should have the very close connection. The second one, just like a main side, we probably hope that we can have the not the private, but some individual school online info session instead of the public one, which means the college counselors can really guide the students and also can organize and make it a really promising turnout. And also we have different organizations in China, like China ICAC and also BACC, and also we have CCABA, that is the Great Bay Area, and the Beijing Academy of College Counseling. So if you believe it's time consuming, you just let us know, and also we will host this kind of organization consortium info session for the older members, schools, students to join in. We have done this before for the BACC, that's the Beijing Academy of College Counselor, I think a University of Wisconsin Madison, and also UBC, it's in Canada, they have done this thing, similar thing to the students in these organizations. So we really welcome you guys to do this kind of a small size and really targeted info session instead of the public one. The finally probably is out of your boundary, but I think probably the government really have very good policy to say we want to encourage more overseas college universities come to China to have a joint program. like NYU Shanghai, Queensland Duke, and also some other university in China. I think, that is one thing. Why not just come out, step into China to have this kind of a joint program can really, have a really good promotion marketing and also another field exploration for the university in overseas. Like we know a lot of university in Mid East like Qatar and Carol and some other, the country. Why not come to China? So that is another suggestion. That is the students who are in China and the parents, they for some reason they maybe are not that kind of interested in sending students overseas for education overseas, but they really want overseas education, and they prefer education overseas here in China. So why not?
Awesome. And my quick bit would be, we have a white paper coming out. It'll include some of the stuff I presented and more. It's coming out in about 2 weeks. We'll email it to you. Check it out. Also, if you should definitely be reaching out to counselors and try to kind of segment, your presentations as much as possible according to your particular audiences you can identify, doing those private or semi-private webinars or webcasts. Sunrise also has some recruitment tours we're running for places where we expect it'll be possible to do in-person fairs, and also some webcasts that you should check out as you assess your options. So we have lots of questions and all of them are good. I think we had budgeted until 15 past the hour, but I think we can probably go 5 minutes over. And if anyone has to hop off, obviously we understand and we'll send you the recording. The first question, which Marilyn asked a little while ago, is do we think that there will be more international schools or divisions opening up at public schools? So is there any upcoming changes in government policies towards K-12 international education? Are the 国际部 or 国际班 coming back anytime soon, or are they going to start growing again?
Last I heard, I don't think there are any plans at all from the government to open more international divisions. That's kind of been, I would say, banned.
Yeah, the new approvals I hear of haven't, they basically, especially in the first and upper second tier cities, the new approvals for new international departments have kind of been turned off or are very closely scrutinized.
Yeah, that's why like DuPont has been opening their own international school, like their private, like a separate school. It won't be on campus of a public one anymore.
So
Yeah,
James asks,
I think no. The reason is like two things. The first one, for the government officials, like the policies, education administration right now, they just like give the right authority for the local or the district education administration to decide whether they will offer this kind of, the new open new international division in the public school. So which means like the person who really offer it doesn't mean that he just offer. He has to be responsible for anything happening in this curriculum. So which means like the most of the cities, second tier, third tier, even some first tier cities, they don't want to do it because like they take a lot of responsibility and also pressure. The second thing is we will see that it's private school, international school, even for those group people, those schools, they are hard to get the license from the government. So no matter it's a private international or even just a private school, it's hard for them to get a license from the government so far. So it's not kind of easy for the public school to have the international division, new one. But on the other hand, probably some cities, some districts, they will expand the cohort of the class, but doesn't mean that they will have a new school to have a new program. I don't know whether I'm clear about the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, James has an interesting question about community colleges. I was trying to tease out this a little bit earlier, but about like questions about regional schools or schools that compete a little bit more on make their proposition as great value, even if you may not have heard of us before, before you started doing your college search. Yeah, I guess given the economic challenges, are any of the students you've worked with or heard about any greater appetite or coming around to community colleges in the US?
Sorry again. I think community college is the government to probably also Education USA give a lot of promotion about the community college to say it's a really money saving, and also it's a really fast track for the students who get into or transfer to the top public school system. This kind of strength. But here I shouldn't say the students here in China, the parents, they are not a huge concern about the expense. They're huge concern about the security and the safety. They're concerned about whether they will get the education they want overseas. So they worried about the approach of the control of the COVID-19 in the States. So I don't think it's a really nice time to do a lot of promotion in the community college here, especially community college. I don't think all of them, or maybe most of them, they don't have the campus dormitory, which also give a more sensitive topic about the security and the safety issue in the parents and the students.
Yeah, so if you're recruiting for community college, I think it would be very important to speak to those concerns that parents have and point to those examples of alumni, ideally even local alumni in a given city that you're recruiting in, who've graduated and gone on to do good things. So I suspect I know what your answers will be, but let's have it anyway. So what do you guys think about working with agents? And particularly in the context of the difficulty of U.S. overseas reps getting back to the U.S. How do you guys feel about agents attending fairs or leaning more on agents given the difficulty of going and recruiting face to face?
So it's gonna be on our school profile. It's on our college counseling handbook. Chinland School does not work with agents. We do not encourage our students to work with agents. We will not work with students who work with agents. So from our side, it's a big no, just because, obviously there are agents for different things. You might just use the agents to recruit, so they don't necessarily make the decisions, or you give them the power to make adjustment to the application. I don't know what your contract looks like, but what will be the point of a college counselor in school college counselor then? How do you verify the authenticity of the applications that you're getting? Once you start working with agents, what's your plan going forward once COVID-19 is over? I think these are huge implications about moving that step, and that have a huge impact in sort of the college counseling and international missions in China, especially since that has been an issue to begin with.
And Francis, you and I gave a presentation at International ACAC in July where we talked an awful lot about some like unlikely, I guess, questions you might ask about like whether or not a student agent relationship is above board, like sharing passwords for Common App and all that stuff. But I guess taking a step back, what do you think about is working more with agents kind of an okay crutch for COVID? In the short term, what are your feelings about that?
I have a lot of complicated feelings about that. I think at first, I think maybe it depends, like what, there's a lot of different meanings to the word agent. It could be, a company that has a financial relationship with a university that does recruiting on their behalf. It represents, the university in abroad or in other countries. It could be a kind of a more mercenary application consultant who is paid to increase the competitiveness of a student's college applications. Kind of, it doesn't matter how necessarily as much as they, the results for them. And so I think, is it an acceptable crutch? I mean, it depends, I think, honestly on what kind of resources the student has available. A lot of parts of China, I'd say most of China does not have experienced or well-developed or well-networked college counselors yet. And that's changing slowly, but I think there's still a lot of, the reason why I think so many application consultants and independent consultants and agents exist is partly because there's a huge information gap. And so, I guess for our students, a lot of them do use application consultants. We try to discourage that. We try to do what we can to to police the applications that our students send out. But it's ultimately it's like the way that our school, for example, views it is it's a family's choice.
Shiny, any thoughts on the agent question?
I think as agents, the question is interesting because like for the school counselors, we probably prefer students to work with the in-school based college counselors like us. But the agent also have different kinds of, just like Francis said, that one kind of we call independent counselors or some consultant outside, like third party. Some are really good, and also they just focusing on the thing, and they do it a transparent way. And this like the students' parents, they can afford it, they want to fund it. We cannot guarantee they do not fund them for some help. I mean, that is impossible. But on the other hand, some agents just like the business driven and the money driven guys, so they will do whatever they want, not the parents want, the students want, or some of the parents students want, they will do whatever they want. So so that is not the agent we want the students to fund. And also, I think another kind of agent, just like Francis said, like the business, some agreement with some universities representative overseas. So those group of people, like I heard of like IDP or some other things, some students, they find their help for the UK thing before. And also those group students, I'm sure that it's most of them are not the students in our these 3 or 4 different campuses in the schools. Those group people are from the public, the students and the parents. Maybe they are not satisfied with the Gaokao. Maybe they are not satisfied with the international curriculum, but they haven't studied any international division before, or the international education track. So those group people, they will find the agent. But personally, I think right now, the students or the parents who find this group of people, the agent like IDP or some other things, not for overseas in the States for the higher education, but other countries like Japan, like UK, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. So this group of people, they will find the help, because like they have no idea about how to apply this group countries. So that I find that is a different kind of agent, I think.
Wow. Well, I think that it's, yeah, like I think that the question of agents has always been complicated. I think COVID makes it a little bit more complicated, and of course, national context does matter a lot too. Boy, I feel like we could probably go on for quite a good deal longer, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know that we're about 7 minutes over when we said we would wrap up. So if we don't have, I guess, does anyone have any concluding thoughts or any sort of last things they wanted to share that we didn't get to? Awesome. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Ming, Francis, and Shiny for being a part of this and for getting up, or for being with us so early in the morning on Friday. Happy Chinese New Year in advance to everyone who's spending that in China or who celebrates that. And to everyone else, thanks for joining, and thank you for the great questions. We'll make sure to share the presentation with everyone on follow-up. Do feel free to share it. And yeah, I guess with that said, stay safe, stay sane, and very best of luck with the rest of the application cycle coming up. Take care, everyone, and have a good one.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.